Right now, you are not making decisions. You are executing a program written years ago, and most people never realize the difference.
That gap between believing you are choosing and actually repeating is where everything important lies.
Not in your goals, not in your achievements. In the space between stimulus and reaction, the territory most people never enter.
And the reason most people never enter it is not because they lack intelligence or desire. It is because the version of themselves they carry feels safe.
Predictable, recognizable, even when it quietly prevents any real movement forward.
And here is the uncomfortable part. That version of you has been reinforced so many times, it no longer needs your permission. The ancient Stoics understood something about this that most modern thinking overlooks entirely. They did not pursue self-improvement through accumulation, more habits, more routines, more systems. They pursued it through subtraction, stripping away illusion, dissolving the dependencies, exposing the patterns that had never been examined because they had never needed to be.
Because when something functions automatically, the mind does not question it. It simply uses it, and a mind that never questions what it uses will always be used by what it never questioned.
That is the actual problem, not motivation, not willpower, not the difficulty of change.
The problem is the invisible architecture of the self, the set of responses, interpretations, and reactions that operate beneath your awareness.
When you wake up each morning before you have made a single conscious choice, that architecture is already active, already shaping how you receive the day. You reach for your phone the same way. You feel irritation at the same kinds of things.
You hesitate in the same situations. You shrink in the same conversations. And because all of it is so fluid, so practiced, so frictionless, it registers not as behavior but as identity.
Not as something you do, but as something you are. But you are not what repeats automatically. You are what remains when the repetition is interrupted. The question is whether you are willing to cause that interruption, even once, even briefly, and sit with what surfaces.
Marcus Aurelius wrote that a person's inner world takes on the texture of what they consistently think.
Not what they intend to think, not what they wish they thought, what actually moves through the mind day after day unchallenged. If those thoughts have been shaped by fear, by old wounds, by inherited assumptions, then the inner world is not built from truth.
It is built from residue, and residue, no matter how familiar it feels, is not a foundation. You see this operating in the small interactions.
Someone delivers a passing comment, and your entire mood shifts before you have processed the words. An uncertain situation appears, and your body braces before your mind has evaluated it. A clear opportunity surfaces, and instead of moving toward it, something inside you reaches for reasons to wait.
None of this feels like a choice. It feels like reality, and that is precisely why it is so difficult to question.
Because when a pattern feels like reality, questioning it feels like questioning yourself, and most people will do almost anything to avoid that.
Epictetus was direct about where the actual disruption point lies. He said it is not circumstances that disturb us. It is the judgments we apply to circumstances. That single observation changes the entire frame. Because if your judgment is automatic, if it fires before you are even aware of it, then your response to life is not free. It is pre-written, shaped by interpretations, formed long before the moment you are actually living.
And those interpretations will continue to govern you until they are brought into the light and examined for whether they still apply.
The invitation here is not to feel worse about yourself. It is to feel more clearly about yourself.
There is a difference between guilt and precision. Guilt keeps you small. Precision sets you free.
And precision begins the moment you stop asking what is wrong with your life and start asking what is operating in your mind that produces this result.
That shift from blaming circumstance to examining response is where every real change begins. There exists a pause that lives between what happens to you and what you do next.
It is extraordinarily brief. Most people never locate it because their reaction moves faster than their awareness.
The stimulus arrives, the conditioned response fires, and by the time consciousness catches up, behavior has already happened.
What follows the justification, the narration, the story you tell yourself, all of it occurs after the fact?
But the pause is real, and learning to inhabit it, even partially, even imperfectly, is the actual practice.
Not meditation for the sake of calm, not affirmations for the sake of comfort.
The practice of finding that pause, widening it slightly, and placing a conscious choice inside it before the automatic response fills it by default.
You are not the pattern running through you. You are the awareness watching it move.
And the moment you see that distinction, the moment it becomes experiential rather than intellectual, something in the architecture shifts.
It does not collapse, it does not transform overnight, but it loosens, and in that loosening you begin to notice things you would ordinarily have moved past without registering.
The impulse that arrives before the action, the hesitation that precedes the familiar retreat, the quiet pull toward explanation when silence would serve you better.
You see these things not with judgment but with recognition, and recognition, sustained, changes the conditions.
Not through force, through observation.
If the ideas being presented here are producing something useful in you, a sense of recognition, a sharper inner clarity, then consider staying in that space.
The channel, Silent Billionaire Mindset, exists precisely for this purpose, not to entertain, but to return you consistently to the kind of thinking that sharpens everything else.
Subscribing is not just an action. It is a decision about the kind of input you are willing to return to regularly.
This is where the actual work begins, not in a resolution, in a recognition.
The recognition that what has always felt natural was never actually chosen. It was simply repeated until it felt that way.
And once you truly understand that repetition is not identity, the phrase you have used for years to explain yourself away starts to sound different.
This is just who I am. You have said it. Most people have. It carries a quiet authority. It sounds like honesty, like groundedness, like self-knowledge.
But look more carefully at what it actually does. It converts a pattern into a permanent fact. It takes behavior, something learned, practiced, reinforced, and grants it the status of essence.
Unchangeable, fixed, no longer available for questioning. But identity, when examined without the protection of habit, is not a solid object.
It is a record, a running total of repeated decisions, compiled over time, until the repetition began to feel like substance.
What you have practiced the most has simply become the most convincing, and conviction about a pattern is not the same as the pattern being correct. The comfort of believing yourself fixed is real, and it serves a function. If your nature is settled, then your limitations are settled too.
You are no longer responsible for examining what you have accepted. You no longer have to face the possibility that the hesitation you have lived with was never inevitable. It was cultivated.
Slowly, through repetition, without your full awareness, the cost of that comfort, though, is everything that was possible on the other side of the examination you avoided.
Seneca observed that suffering most often arrives before the events that supposedly cause it, arriving in anticipation, in imagination, in the stories we tell ourselves in advance. And among those stories, the ones about who we are tend to be the most expensive, because they do not just interpret the present.
They limit the future. They determine in advance what you will attempt, what you will believe is available, and what you will write off before it is tested.
This is just who I am.
often translates precisely to, "This is the response I have practiced far more than any other."
You have practiced the withdrawal, the deflection, the over-explanation, the self-diminishment.
Not because you chose these intentionally, but because conditions shaped them, and conditions are not character.
Character, in the Stoic framework, is not something buried inside you waiting to be uncovered. It is something produced through deliberate, consistent action over time.
That distinction matters enormously, because if character is constructed, not discovered, then it can be reconstructed deliberately.
It is not fixed. It is a current output, not a permanent substrate. But the construction cannot happen in the dark.
It requires honesty, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that locates the moments where you defaulted to habit and asks, without flinching, whether the habit served you or simply arrived first.
Those moments are abundant. They are everywhere in an ordinary day, and they are easy to overlook because each one seems inconsequential. The pause before the response you gave automatically, the thought you dismissed without examining, the familiar narrative you reached for instead of sitting with genuine uncertainty.
These are not trivial. They are the actual material of character, the small repeated moments that, accumulated, produce the person you experience yourself as being.
Carl Jung wrote that whatever remains unconscious in a person will direct their life, and they will interpret that direction as fate.
Not as habit, not as conditioning, as fate, as something that was always going to happen, as the inevitable shape of who they are.
Fate is one of the most effective concealment strategies available to the unexamined mind.
But the moment the unconscious is brought into the light, seen clearly, named honestly, traced back to its origins, it loses its authority.
Not immediately, not completely, but meaningfully. What once felt inevitable begins to look like a pattern.
What looked like a pattern begins to look like a choice, and choices, unlike fate, can be redirected.
That redirection is not dramatic. It does not announce itself.
It begins in a single moment when you catch a familiar response in motion before it completes, and introduce a brief interval of awareness.
Not suppression, not forced alternatives, just awareness, a slight delay between the signal and the standard reply.
In that delay, something new becomes possible, not guaranteed, not effortless, but possible, and possibility, in a life governed by automatic patterns, is the beginning of everything.
The challenge is that new choices feel wrong at first, not because they are, but because they are unfamiliar, and unfamiliar registers as incorrect to a brain built for efficiency. Your mind is not designed to pursue growth. It is designed to preserve function, and function is built on efficiency, and efficiency is built on repetition.
The smoother a pattern runs, the less energy it requires, and the more the mind trusts it.
So when you introduce something new, a different response, a shifted posture, an interrupted reaction, there is immediate friction.
The system resists, not maliciously, mechanically. Most people interpret this friction as a signal to stop.
They feel the discomfort of acting outside their pattern and conclude, from that discomfort, that they were wrong.
That the new direction does not fit them, that they should return to what comes naturally.
But what comes naturally was built deliberately just so long ago, and so incrementally that the construction became invisible.
Marcus Aurelius grounded his entire practice in a principle that sounds deceptively simple. If something is not right, do not do it.
If something is not true, do not say it. The simplicity is the point, because in the moment of discomfort, simplicity is the only tool available. When the familiar response is pulling hard and the new choice requires genuine presence, a complex philosophy collapses.
A clear principle holds: the real effort lies in these small, quiet intersections, not in grand transformation.
not in the dramatic decisions that get narrated and shared.
In the unremarkable moments where the habitual pull is strong and the conscious alternative is uncertain, and you choose the uncertain one anyway.
Each time you do, the pattern weakens, not visibly, not in a way that receives recognition, but structurally at the level where change actually occurs.
At the beginning, this is awkward. There is a quality of slowness, a loss of fluency.
You feel less confident in the new response than you did in the automatic one, even when the new response is objectively better aligned with who you want to become.
This is not a malfunction. It is the cost of transition. Fluency in the new pattern is available.
But it requires the same process that produced fluency in the old one: repetition, sustained attention, and patience with the discomfort of incompletion.
Epictetus said that nothing significant is ever built in a single moment. That applies as precisely to the interior as it does to anything visible in the world.
The ability to act with full intention instead of automatic response is not a sudden acquisition.
It is a gradual construction accumulated through the practice of pausing, choosing, adjusting, and returning
again, because the old patterns will still surface. They were not deleted, they were simply out-practiced.
When the old response reasserts itself, when you react in the familiar way before you registered that you were reacting, that is not failure.
That is the process demonstrating that it requires continued attention. The objective is not a final state of perfection.
It is the development of an ongoing relationship with your own attention, an increasingly honest relationship in which you notice sooner, adjust more readily, and recover with less self-judgment.
The goal is awareness, the kind that catches the pattern while it is moving, not only in retrospect.
Because discomfort is temporary by nature, the new response, once practiced enough times, loses its quality of strangeness.
It begins to feel like possibility rather than threat. And once you have had even one experience of choosing outside your pattern and discovering that the ceiling you assumed was not structural, that nothing catastrophic occurred when you moved.
Differently, the authority of the old pattern diminishes, not entirely, but enough. Your relationship with discomfort begins to change.
Instead of a wall, it becomes a doorway. Instead of a signal to retreat, it becomes information. You are at an edge.
An edge is not a destination. It is a threshold, and thresholds are where the actual territory of growth begins, not in the familiar land on this side, but in the unmapped space on the other.
And once you have crossed one threshold deliberately, the next one requires slightly less preparation.
This brings forward something that most people walk past without examining, something embedded in the way they move through social environments, professional settings, intimate conversations.
The version of you that exists in front of one person is not identical to the version that exists in front of another.
And most of the time, you do not decide to be different. It simply happens, a modulation so practiced and so seamless that it requires no conscious instruction.
Your vocal tone adjusts, the vocabulary shifts, you become slightly louder or considerably quieter.
You hold back specific thoughts. You amplify certain aspects of your personality while allowing others to recede. All of it shaped by a long, established calculation about what each environment requires, about what will be acceptable, what will be appreciated, and more importantly, what will be received without
Rejection, this is not always a problem. Calibration has legitimate uses. A person who cannot read a room cannot function well in the world.
But there is a substantial difference between calibration that comes from awareness and adjustment that comes from compulsion.
Between adapting because you choose to and adapting because you cannot locate the option to remain steady.
When the adjustment is automatic, when it fires before you could have decided, it is not a social skill. It is a conditioned survival response wearing the costume of a social skill, and the more consistently that response fires, the more fragmented the self becomes.
A slightly different version installed in each context, each one coherent within its setting, none of them fully aligned with the one that exists in the quiet moments when no observation is present.
Over time, that fragmentation produces a kind of interior distance, a faint but persistent sense of dislocation, as if the self that speaks in public and the self that sits in silence are acquaintances rather than the same person. The Stoics examined this with particular care. Not because they believed a person should be rigid, they valued appropriate expression. But they understood that a person governed by principle does not need to rebuild their foundation for each audience.
The expression changes, the foundation does not. Seneca wrote that wisdom is never accidental. It is constructed through sustained, deliberate attention to how one acts and why.
In the absence of that attention, behavior defaults to whatever the environment rewards. The approval, seeking response.
The conflict, avoiding posture. The performance of a version of yourself that you have learned generates acceptance in this particular setting.
And while none of this is malicious, the accumulation of it is costly, because each automatic adjustment teaches you again that your internal state is subordinate to external feedback.
That who you are should be shaped by what others will accept. That teaching, repeated enough times, becomes architecture.
And architecture governs everything that moves through it. Carl Jung expressed the stakes of this precisely. The greatest achievement available in a lifetime is to become who you actually are.
Not who you have performed, not who you have been allowed to be in the environments that formed you.
Who you are when the performance is suspended and only the actual self remains.
But becoming that person requires noticing, first, where the performance is happening, not to condemn it, but to see it clearly.
To identify the shifts in tone and language and energy that signal an unconscious adjustment is underway.
To ask with curiosity rather than judgment whether this adjustment is chosen or compelled. Consistency is not rigidity.
It is the refusal to abandon your foundation every time the audience changes.
When you begin to develop that kind of inner consistency, when your behavior stays anchored to something internal, rather than always being remapped by something external, the experience of
yourself changes. You feel less need to monitor how you are being received, less need to manage interpretations in real time,
less need to pre-edit your thoughts before they are formed.
The energy previously directed toward those adjustments becomes available for something else, for presence, for actual connection, for the quality of attention that produces real thought rather
than managed impression. This does not always make interactions simpler in the short term.
There are contexts that have been trained to expect a particular version of you, and when you arrive as a more consistent version, the mismatch produces friction.
That friction is real and worth acknowledging.
But it is the friction of genuine encounter, more useful than the frictionless smoothness of a performance that satisfies everyone in the room while satisfying nothing in you.
Over time, as this becomes the default rather than the exception, the architecture shifts.
You become harder to manipulate, not because you have built defenses, but because you no longer require the validation that manipulation typically leverages.
Your responses become less predictable because they are no longer being calculated for a specific external effect.
They arise from something steadier, something internal, something that does not shift with every change in the room.
And steadiness, once it becomes structural, produces a kind of freedom that no external achievement can provide.
The Stoics paid careful attention to a specific vulnerability, one that operates so deeply in most people that it passes entirely unnoticed.
The tendency to attach the stability of the self to things that cannot be controlled.
to emotional investments in outcomes that belong to chance, to other people's responses, to circumstances that will unfold according to their own logic regardless of how urgently you need them to
unfold differently. Epictetus named the boundary with characteristic directness. Bring your full capability to what falls within your authority.
Receive everything else as it arrives. The principle is clear, the application is not, because the mind does not want to respect that boundary.
It reaches past it habitually.
It anticipates outcomes, builds scenarios, attaches emotional stakes to results before they have occurred, and then responds to disappointment with the intensity of someone who had reasonable
grounds to expect a different result, when in fact the expectation was never grounded in anything controllable.
The emotional disruption, in most cases, was not caused by what happened, it was caused by the attachment that preceded what happened. This is where behavior becomes reactive in the deepest sense, not reactive to circumstances, but reactive to the distance between imagined outcomes and actual ones.
You are not just responding to what is in front of you. You are responding to the gap between what you needed to happen and what happened instead.
And that gap, entirely internal, entirely produced by the nature of your attachment, generates suffering that feels like it came from outside. Seneca said that the brave are free. The freedom he meant was not freedom from consequence. It was freedom from the compulsion to need a specific outcome in order to remain stable.
The ability to act fully, to engage completely, to give genuine effort without making the continuity of the self contingent on the result.
This is not detachment in the sense of indifference. It is something more demanding, full presence without ownership of the outcome.
You engage because it is the right action, not because you have guaranteed a specific return. You speak because it is true, not because you require a particular reception.
You work because it matters, not because you need it to be recognized in a particular way.
And in that release, which is not passive but enormously active, attention concentrates rather than scatters.
Think about how much cognitive and emotional bandwidth is currently spent anticipating outcomes that have not yet arrived.
Constructing the scenario in which things go well, managing the anxiety of the scenario in which they do not.
Adjusting behavior in advance to influence perceptions that have not yet formed, when that bandwidth is no longer consumed by attachment to the unknowable, it becomes available for quality.
For the precision of thought and action that actually shapes outcomes, you stop managing what you cannot touch and start refining what you can.
When something unfolds differently than you hoped, the response changes. There is still evaluation. The Stoics were not advocates for numbness.
There is still recognition of difficulty where difficulty is real.
But the disruption is shorter, the recovery is faster, and the path forward is clearer, because the stability of the self was never fully tied to this particular result.
You notice, you adjust, you continue, not without feeling, but without being dismantled. Uncertainty stops being a threat.
It becomes the actual texture of existence, neither alarming nor welcome, simply the condition in which all action takes place.
And when you are no longer spending energy trying to eliminate it, you can move within it more freely.
More deliberately, with less of the paralysis that comes from needing circumstances to be simpler than they are before you are willing to act.
Validation, over time, shifts from requirement to information. It can be received without depending on it.
It can be absent without destabilizing anything foundational. Its presence or absence becomes data, not a verdict.
And that shift from needing approval to simply being able to receive it without collapsing when it does not arrive produces a quality of action that was previously unavailable.
Because the action is no longer conditional, it proceeds from clarity rather than from need. And with that shift, much of the internal tension that once assembled itself around outcomes begins to quiet.
Not completely, not permanently, but consistently enough to change the way you move through each day.
Less reactive, more present, guided more reliably by what you have decided matters, all of which produces a final, unexpected change. The need to speak diminishes.
Not because you have less to say, because the relationship between speech and self begins to function differently.
Previously, words served as evidence, proof of progress, demonstration of intent, management of perception.
A constant low-level narration designed to keep others updated or to keep yourself convinced that something meaningful was occurring.
As the internal architecture stabilizes, that narration becomes less necessary. You begin to experience the difference between speaking from clarity and speaking to produce it.
And once you have experienced the first, the second begins to feel like what it actually is, performance wearing the disguise of communication.
Epictetus said, "Speak only what is necessary, and in few words, unless context demands otherwise." The discipline behind that instruction is not about becoming cold or inaccessible.
It is about preserving the quality of attention that language, when used carelessly, disperses. Every word spoken without intention directs energy outward.
Every intention spoken prematurely dilutes itself through exposure to external reaction before it has fully formed.
An idea declared before it is established is no longer yours in quite the same way. It is now subject to interpretation, to doubt, to the opinions of people who encountered it before it was solid.
There is a particular phenomenon that operates when you announce intentions.
Psychologically, the act of describing a future action produces a faint version of the reward associated with completing it.
The narration creates a ghost of the satisfaction, and once that ghost has arrived, the urgency behind the actual action reduces.
This is not a character flaw, it is a feature of how reward systems operate, but knowing it changes the relationship with speech.
If announcing provides relief, and relief reduces drive, and drive is what produces the action, then announcement can quietly undermine the thing it seems to be supporting.
Moving in silence is not concealment. It is structural protection for the process of becoming. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the argument about what a good person should be is a waste of time.
Become one. The economy of that instruction is severe but accurate, because the gap between discussing direction and moving in one is exactly where most effort quietly dissipates. The discussion is easy. It generates a feeling of progress without requiring the conditions under which progress actually occurs.
The movement is harder, slower, less immediately gratifying, but it compounds, and compounding, invisible in the short term, is where everything significant accumulates.
Over time, as the internal foundation deepens, the need for external confirmation fades, not because the world becomes less important, but because the self becomes more settled.
The work itself becomes sufficient confirmation, not because praise is unwelcome, but because the absence of it no longer constitutes a crisis.
What you are building has become real enough that it does not require external acknowledgement to maintain its substance.
This is where the final dimension opens, discipline that exists whether or not anyone is watching. Most effort, if examined honestly, carries an audience somewhere inside it.
Not always a physical audience, sometimes only the internal observer who monitors performance and delivers the verdict.
But an audience nonetheless.
And when that audience is removed, when there is genuinely no one to report to, no metric to produce, no feedback loop to close, what remains is the actual foundation of your discipline.
What you do when there is no consequence for doing nothing. The Stoics understood this to be the only reliable form of character development.
Not behavior shaped by accountability structures, not effort produced by social pressure.
Behavior that arises from what you have decided you are, regardless of whether the decision is witnessed, validated, or acknowledged by anyone outside the self.
Seneca wrote about the specific quality of progress achieved in solitude,
not visible from the outside, not demonstrable to others, but unmistakable to the self.
That unmistakability matters because it produces a form of trust in your own actions, not based on their reception, but based on their consistency.
And that trust, accumulated gradually through private repetition, becomes the substrate of everything that happens publicly.
The visible results, when they arrive, are not the thing. They are evidence of something built earlier in the unremarkable daily decisions to continue when continuity was not required.
Carl Jung described the inward turn with precision. Whoever looks outside is dreaming. Whoever looks inside is awakening.
That awakening is not a single moment, it is a direction.
A reorientation of attention from the constant monitoring of how things appear to the steadier examination of what is actually occurring beneath that appearance.
And beneath the appearance, in the quiet of genuine self-observation, the architecture becomes legible. You see where you are consistent, where you still default, where the old pattern reasserts itself and you participate in it before you noticed you were choosing.
None of this observation is meant to produce condemnation. It is meant to produce clarity.
And clarity, more than any technique, more than any system, more than any motivational structure, is what allows genuine movement.
Because you cannot change what you cannot see, and once you can see it, once it becomes visible as a pattern rather than invisible as identity, the authority it holds begins to dissolve. Not through effort, through the simple application of continued attention. The strength that builds through this process is not loud.
It does not declare itself or seek recognition. It is visible only in how you move through difficulty without collapsing.
In how steadily you act in the absence of applause, in how cleanly you respond when circumstances do not cooperate with your expectations.
In the quality of presence you bring to interactions that have no immediate reward, that strength is structural.
It does not depend on conditions remaining favorable. It continues regardless. Think about what it would mean to operate from that kind of base.
Not strength borrowed from circumstances, from a good outcome, from others' praise, from a favorable reading of how things are going,
but strength that is resident.
That lives inside the architecture you have been constructing through each deliberate choice, each interrupted pattern, each moment of staying with discomfort rather than retreating from it.
This is the form of resilience the Stoics were actually pointing at, not emotional toughness as a defense. Rootedness as a foundation. When you're rooted in that way, the texture of difficulty changes. You still encounter friction. You still face disappointment, misunderstanding, the ordinary accumulation of circumstances that do not align with what you hoped.
None of that disappears, but it does not reach the same depth, because the self it lands on is no longer structured around the need for things to go well.
It is structured around the capacity to continue regardless.
And that capacity, quiet, invisible, accumulated over time through repeated private choices, is the thing that generates what looks, from the outside, like composure.
What looks like confidence? What looks like the kind of ease that certain people carry that others cannot quite name?
It is not ease born from an easy life. It is ease born from a practiced relationship with difficulty.
From having been to the edge of your comfort, the edge of your familiar self-concept, and chosen the unfamiliar option anyway, enough times that the edge no longer produces the same quality of
alarm, because presence does not need to be explained. It simply arrives. This is not about isolation.
The inward work does not require withdrawal from others. It requires only a reorientation of foundation, from seeking validation externally to building reliability internally.
You still connect, still engage, still share, but the engagement is no longer the source of the self.
It is an expression of it, and the difference between those two things changes everything about the quality of the connection.
What you bring to other people, to conversations, to work, to relationships, stops being a performance designed to produce a specific reception.
It becomes something more honest, and in that honesty, more genuinely useful. People can feel the difference.
Not always consciously, but they can feel when someone is present versus performing. And presence, in a world of near constant performance, carries an unusual weight. Presence does not announce itself. It simply changes the quality of everything it enters.
Consider the last conversation you had where you felt genuinely met, where the other person was fully there, not managing an impression, not performing attentiveness, but actually present.
You likely do not remember the specific words exchanged. What you remember is the quality of the encounter. The sense that something real occurred. That is what becomes available when the internal architecture is settled enough that you are no longer occupied with your own management.
That is what you can offer, not as a technique, not as a practiced behavior, but as a natural consequence of the work you have been doing privately, in the unremarkable hours when no one was
present to acknowledge the effort. Most people, as this comes to a close, will return to what is familiar.
Not because they must, not because nothing here reached them, but because the familiar is easier to maintain than the new is to install.
The gap between recognition and implementation is wider than it seems in the moment of recognition.
And without a sustained practice of returning to this kind of thinking, regularly, deliberately, as a discipline rather than a single event, the insight fades and the old architecture resumes.
There is something worth naming honestly about that gap. Recognition, by itself, changes nothing structurally.
You can arrive at the clearest understanding of your patterns, feel the full weight of that clarity, and then watch the insight dissolve over the following days as the ordinary conditions of life reassert themselves, not because you are weak or uncommitted, because cognition is not the same as practice. Understanding is the beginning of a direction, not the completion of one.
And the direction requires repetition, the same mechanism that built the original patterns, now redirected toward something more consciously chosen.
This is what the Stoics meant when they spoke of philosophy not as a subject to be studied, but as a way of living to be practiced.
The study produces the map, the practice produces the territory. And the territory, the actual interior landscape, the felt quality of moving through a day with more intentionality and less compulsion, is only accessible through sustained return to the practice.
Not a single dramatic commitment, a daily return, a quiet, private recommitment each morning to the kind of attention that makes the rest of the work possible.
Every time you pause before the automatic response, you are rewriting something that was never actually written in stone.
Clarity does not have to be spoken repeatedly to be real. It has to be lived.
It has to operate in the small moments, the pause, the choice, the continued return to what you have decided matters even when the easier path is immediately available.
If what was explored here has landed somewhere that feels important, if something in you has reoriented even slightly, then do not let that reorientation disperse.
Stay with it, return to it, let it accumulate through practice rather than discharging through declaration.
There is a particular quality to the kind of change being described here that distinguishes it from the more common varieties.
Most change is surface level, a new behavior installed over an unchanged foundation. It can be maintained while conditions are favorable and collapses when they are not. The change available through the Stoic practice being outlined here operates differently. It works at the level of the foundation itself.
Which is precisely why it is slower, less dramatic, and far more durable than anything built above the surface.
And because it is slow, it demands a kind of faith in the process that is genuinely difficult to maintain, a willingness to continue working when the results are not yet visible, to trust that
private repetition is building something real even when nothing confirms it from the outside. That faith is not blind.
It is based on the logic of accumulation. Small consistent efforts, compounded over time, produce results that no single dramatic effort can replicate.
This is true in physical training, in financial building, and most of all in the interior work of becoming a more intentional, more aware, more fully present version of yourself.
If you found value in this, the channel Silent Billionaire Mindset is dedicated entirely to this kind of thinking.
Hit the like button if this shifted something in you. It helps more people find their way to this content.
Subscribe not as a passive follow, but as a decision to return to this territory regularly, because growth of this kind, interior, structural, foundational, does not happen in a single encounter.
It happens in the return. What remains when the performance is suspended, when the validation is absent, when the audience has gone, is the only thing that was ever truly yours.
A discipline that exists because you decided it should. A foundation that holds because you built it in the quiet, day after day, whether it was seen or not.
That is where the silent wealth lies, not in what you have accumulated, in who you have become when no one was watching.
One final thought. The patterns described here were not created by failure. They were created by survival.
The conditioning that limits you was once functional, a protection that served its purpose. If you approach your patterns with hostility, you are fighting something that once protected you.
What you fight hardens, what you understand yields. The Stoic practice is not a war against the self.
It is a clarification of the self, an honest process of separating what you chose from what was installed, and then choosing deliberately.
That process has no final stage. It is simply the quality of attention you bring to being alive, and that quality, sustained, is indistinguishable from wisdom.
And here, at the close, it is worth returning to the beginning, not to repeat it, but to see it from the other side.
The opening observation was that most people are not making decisions. They are executing a program.
By this point in the exploration, that statement means something different than it did when you first encountered it.
Because now you understand the architecture of that program. You understand how it was written, why it feels permanent even when it is not, and precisely where the intervention points exist.
The Stoic tradition does not promise transformation. It offers something more honest and ultimately more valuable, a practice.
A daily, repeatable engagement with the conditions of your own mind, a willingness to bring conscious attention to what has been running unconsciously,
a commitment to choosing, even in the smallest moments, what you would have chosen had you been fully awake.
That is the practice, not a destination, a direction, not a state to be achieved and maintained, a quality of engagement to be renewed repeatedly for as long as you are willing to do the work.
The quiet is not emptiness. The silence is not absence. The discipline that no one witnesses is not wasted.
It is the precise location where everything real is constructed.
And everything real you have ever built in your character, your relationships, your capacity for genuine response was built there in the unremarkable private moments, one small conscious choice
at a time